He came up to me and he said, "You didn't hear it, but I did ring the bell."
Oh, you told me.
Yeah, he said, "I didn't want to ring it again because I'm sure they heard it out there." He didn't want them to think it was time to come in. Shortest class ever, right? Before we begin tonight, Alex is going to lead us in a word of prayer. Last week we discussed chapter 13. We got into chapter 14 of the book of Judges. And chapters 13, 14, 15, and 16 all talk about which judge? Samuel. Not Samuel, Samson. Yeah. What a contrast, Samson and Samuel. Right? Let's not confuse those two. Okay? So we got 4 chapters here devoted to Samson. And I don't necessarily want you to answer right now, but the question I keep having to ask myself is, why? You know, who is this guy? What does God expect us to learn from him? I was talking to Dee earlier, and I said the best way I can describe Samson is a full-grown juvenile delinquent. You know, this guy's got issues, okay? Yet, how long did he judge Israel? 20 years, okay, 20 years. Now, I don't know, but I don't suppose that it was 20 years of this kind of behavior that we're reading about. I can't imagine Israel coming to Samson to be judged, you know, about their differences or their discords or what have you. But he judged Israel for 20 years. And one of the things that stands out, especially in chapters 14 and 15, well, actually 13 through 15, are chain of events, right? And I just noticed this as I was studying it today. If you take a look at chapter 13, in chapter 13 at verse 5, when the angel announces to Samson's mother, he says, "For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head. For the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines." Okay? He doesn't do it completely, but he's going to begin to do it. And God is the one that's going to act through Samson to bring this about. And then when you think about it, there's this incredible chain of events in chapters 14 and 15. In 14:3, remember, he sees this Philistine woman, and he tells his parents, "She pleases me, you know, go get her for me." And what was his parents' reaction?
Don't you want someone from her?
Yeah. Now think about that for a second. Okay? Put yourself in the place of Samson's parents. This child is, you'd have to say, miraculous. His birth was announced beforehand, right? I mean, it wasn't a miraculous conception like Christ was, but God says, you're going to conceive. This is what's going to happen. He's going to be a Nazirite from birth. He's going to begin to deliver. I mean, no other judge was described this way. Okay? So he is going to begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. All right? So, what do you suppose that his parents are expecting?
Godly child.
A godly child. A godly child, someone who's going to come up and be a hero in Israel, going to be a deliverer in Israel, going to be a man of a good reputation. So by the time you get to chapter 14, and he says, "Go get this Philistine woman, for she pleases me." Now what's going through their mind?
We raised a brat.
What?
We raised a brat.
Yeah, we raised a brat. Okay. That possibly. What else? You think there might be a little confusion here? You know, it's like, wait a second, didn't God tell us that this child was going to grow to be this? And that's not what he is. He does not fit any kind of godly stereotype. He really doesn't. And so they got to be a little bit perplexed by this. But they cave to him. They're going to go down and they're going to get this Philistine woman. Okay? So I also want you to notice in verse 4, but his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Okay? What that tells me, who's in control here? God's in control, right? God is going to use Samson to start delivering Israel from the Philistines. It's not so much that Samson is going to do it, but God is going to do it through Samson. And he's going to use Samson's libido, his poor judgment, right? His weakness for women, his disregard for the law in some respects. He's going to use those things for an occasion against the Philistines. And then he's going to use Samson and endue him with his great strength to be able to start killing these Philistines. What are we going to say, Dan?
And strength.
Yeah, and his strength as well. And so I want you to think about this. We're going to talk about these things as they come along, right? But if you've read chapters 14 and 15, look at it's one continuous story. It's a chain of events. So he sees a woman. He directs his parents to get her. A lion attacks on the way. Bees make a hive. He poses a riddle as a result of that. His wife is threatened. We will burn you and your father's house if you don't find out the answer to this riddle, right? Samson yields to her unending pestering, right? So he yields to her, and so his foes answer the riddle. Samson takes vengeance. He says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. So he goes down, and what does he do? He kills 30 Philistines, right? So he can fulfill his end of the bargain or the bet, if you will, for the riddle. Okay? So he goes away angry. And what happens to his wife?
His best man.
Yeah. He goes to his companion, his best man, right? So Samson's deprived of his wife. We're getting into chapter 15 here. Samson takes vengeance with 300 foxes because he goes down and he says, I want to go into my wife. And the father says, no, right? I gave her to, I thought you surely hated her, right? Here's my youngest daughter, take her. And he's not going to do that. So then he goes out and he catches 300 foxes. Some versions might say jackals. And this is a bizarre part of the story. He ties them together and ties a torch between the tails. So you got 150 pairs with flaming torches, and they run through all the agriculture of the Philistines here. Okay, the wheat has been harvested, the wheat fields, the barley, the grain, the olive trees, the vineyards, and so they destroy the crops of the Philistines. So the Philistines then take vengeance on him by killing his wife and father. Some people suspect they just burned their house down. Some people suspect that they burned them. Okay? So then Samson takes vengeance again. Okay? He takes vengeance and he kills a bunch of them. Then the Philistines come against Judah demanding Samson. They want him arrested, they want him delivered so they can torment him. Judah hands him over. Judah goes to him and says, don't you know these guys are our masters? Right? And he says, well, if you promise not to kill me, I'll let you take me. And so Judah hands him over. The Philistines come at Samson. And what's he do?
Well, the Lord melts the stuff that he's afraid. Melts the binding.
Well, yeah, the binding and everything like that. He breaks the ropes that they tied him with. Says there are new ropes. What's the point of that?
Strong.
They were strong. They weren't afraid. They weren't weakened, right? And so he breaks those, and he kills 1,000. How does he kill them?
With the jawbone.
Yeah, the jawbone of a donkey. Okay? And then it ends with Samson judges Israel 20 years. All of those things, if you look at those things, you read those 2 chapters, it is a chain of events. This leads to this, 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 leads to this. There's a direct connection between every link in that chain. And what that seems to indicate to me is that here's God, and he is the one that's seeking an occasion against the Philistines, and he's using Samson to do it. And so then we come to chapter 16, and chapter 16 is the chapter about that very famous seductress by the name of Delilah, right? Anybody ever know a girl named Delilah? A few, right? I met a girl named Jezebel once. Yikes. It's like, what were you thinking, right? It's like naming your son Judas, okay? But Delilah, a femme fatale, is going to be his undoing. And that seems to be a standalone story that takes place after his interaction with these other 2 women. Another thing that's really kind of, if nothing else, it'll help you win a game of Trivial Pursuit. Okay? What's the most common number in this 4 chapters? 7 comes into play. It's 3. It's 3. Or multiples of 3. Right? 3 women. Right? He tells Delilah 3 different ways that she can rob him of his strength before he caves and gives her the truth. 3,000 men of Judah come to take him. He just has 30 companions at his wedding. He murders 30 of them, right? There 3 pops up over and over and over and over and over again. And I don't know if that has any significance whatsoever, but people seem to make a big deal out of it, okay? You read about Samson, you read in the scholarly works about Samson, and there's not a whole lot of, okay, this means it's wrong to gamble. Really? Is that what we get out of the story of Samson? It's wrong to gamble, right? We've got these 4 chapters, and I've got to wonder, what in the world is God trying to tell us here? I think that's one of the first keys of Bible study. Why is God telling me this? Okay? Where does Samson, in the history of Judges, where does Samson occur? Who are the judges we read about after Samson in the book of Judges? There aren't any. There aren't any after Samson. Not in the book of Judges. Right? There's Micah and his idolatry. Then there's the war of Israel against the Benjamites. And it talks about there's no king in Israel. Everybody did that which was right in his own eyes. You don't read about the next 2 judges until 1 Samuel. Eli and then Samuel. Okay? Eli wasn't a very good judge. But if you remember what we've seen in these judges, they started off, who is the first judge? Othniel, right? And he seems to have been a pretty stand-up, honorable, godly man. Okay? He was the one that Caleb gave his daughter to when he went out and drove out the inhabitants. Okay? And so, from Othniel, you have this subtle but consistent degradation of the character of these judges. Until finally you're getting to Samson, and he's a wreck. You know, Jephthah, you know, wasn't the greatest before him. You had Gideon, whose ephod, you know, presented a problem to him. So even the judges themselves show kind of a degradation in their character. Yet, over in verse, 32 or 34 of Hebrews 11, Samson is mentioned as one of the faithful. Okay? Why? How would you explain that? Okay, think about this. Samson was attacked by this lion when he was on his way down to get the first wife, okay? And he's attacked by this lion. This lion just jumps out of nowhere, apparently. And it says he tears it with his bare hands. He tears it apart as a man might tear apart a goat. I read that and think, I can't imagine it would be easy to tear apart a goat with your bare hands, right? But Samson has his way with his lion, right? Then afterwards, he turns aside He's either going back home or he's coming back down. He turns aside, and what does he find when he goes to find this lion?
Honey in the carcass.
He finds that bees have built a hive in it, and they're producing honey. Okay? What's he do? He takes it, and he starts eating it. And then what's he do with it?
Gives it to his mom and dad.
He gives it to his mom and dad, but he doesn't tell them where it came from. Why not?
He's under a Nazarite vow.
What?
He's under a Nazarite vow.
He's under a Nazarite vow? Well, what's that got to do with anything?
Well, Numbers, it talks about you can't touch a dead person, but it doesn't say dead animals, I'm not sure.
The lion is an unclean animal. It's a dead, unclean animal, and he takes this honey out of this dead, unclean animal. Okay? This is not good for him to do. And no Jew that was following the law of Moses would be eating this honey. Right? So he does that. Later on, when he kills 1,000 Philistines, what does he do it with? The fresh bone, jawbone of a donkey. Is a donkey a clean animal? Nope. So again, it doesn't seem like he's got any consciousness of what he's doing as far as Nazarite from the womb, right? And then the law of Moses on top of that. And so here you've got Samson, and it's like you just see this reckless abandon in him with what he wants to do. Even the foxes and the jackals are unclean. But he goes out and he catches 300 of them. And, sets them on fire, or basically sets torches on fire, and sets all the agriculture of the Philistines on fire. So,
What's interesting to me is that he keeps wanting the Nazarite vow. He keeps going against it, and God stays with him again and again and again. He stays in the line until it gets to where he cuts hair, and he still thought that God would be. He did not know God would let him.
right.
So all the way until then, he knew God was going to stay with him. He just felt that, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, going after Philistine women, right? Which he wasn't supposed to be doing at all. And so you've just really got this odd character here in Samson. So how, after all that, is he listed among God's faithful in Hebrews chapter 11?
Because when he was in jail, he had time to think about it.
When the Philistines actually took him captive, right, and said they made him a grinder in their prison. What's that mean, made him a grinder?
Isn't that the same thing as an ox walking around and around and around?
I think so. That's the way I've seen it depicted, anyway. The classic film, I don't know who made it, but Victor Mature played Samson, right? I don't know who played Delilah, but that's the way they depicted it. He was pushing a grindstone around a circle. Around and around. He was chained to it. He's blind because they had taken out his eyes. Okay? It's kind of interesting that 2 of the 3 women, in fact, if you take a look at chapter 16, verse 21, it says, "And the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza. They bound him with bronze fetters. He became a grinder in the prison." If you look at 14:1, "Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman." Then you look at 16:1. "And Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her." And then, of course, in 16:4, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Some people draw a comparison between his eyes being put out and the fact that it's these women, and seeing these women that have led him down the paths that he has gone down. He's got a weakness for their attractiveness.
Okay. You asked a question about you said that he was a godly man.
Right.
But didn't he kind of redeem himself when he was at the very end, when he killed all of those?
At the very end, he asked God for one last act of strength. In verse 28, chapter 16, it says, "Then Samson called to the Lord, saying, O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Okay? He wants to take vengeance again. It's always him taking vengeance. And so he wants to take vengeance for his 2 eyes. What's interesting about verse 28 is when he says, I pray just this once, okay? That's the same word as chapter 13 at verse 25, where it says, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move or drive upon him and Manahath Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. So at the beginning, in verse 25, chapter 13, the Spirit is driving him, okay? I don't think it's driving him to do the things that he's doing, but it's moving upon him, right? Let's think about that for a second. Does God allow the Spirit to drive a person in one direction or another? You know, and some of those directions might not be the most godly. Can you think of any other instance?
You can drive sheep, that doesn't mean one's not gonna go off wherever it wants to go.
Okay, that's true, right? God sent an evil spirit upon to Saul, right? You know, to drive him, to antagonize him, right? And then he started persecuting David. I think there's a few other passages which talk about that as well. But here, God begins to drive Samuel, and at the end of his life, he asks him to drive him one more time, right? In his prayer for strength. And so he pushes apart the pillars. Also, how many people were sitting on the roof? In verse 27.
3,000.
3,000. Again, there's that multiple of 3. Men and women on the roof who watched while Samson performed. So the temple was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there. In fact, there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof. So there's a lot of people in this stadium, okay, not just the 3,000. And it says in verse 29, Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars which supported the temple, and he braced himself against them, one on the right, the other on the left. And then Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed with all his might. And the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. And his brothers and his father's household came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. And he had judged Israel 20 years. Right? So it says twice that he had judged Israel 20 years. Randy.
Well, he's basically a train wreck, and he is judging over others for 20 years, which is such a critical thing.
Yeah.
I mean, think that someone with this horrible judgment has any ability to judge over others. It's just sad to me, but I mean,
Yeah.
I understand it, but for him to be a judge is just what's striking.
Yeah, for him to be a judge is really striking. Okay, so let's consider the possibilities here. Okay, I mean, what's the state of Israel at this time? They're rejecting God. They're repeatedly rejecting God. Okay, so perhaps God is giving them a judge intentionally that exercises poor judgment, right? Or perhaps God is still using Samuel as he judges the people for him to be able to render wise or equitable judgment. Don't know. But God tells Israel, you know, in the prophets, I think it's Jeremiah, might be Jeremiah, says, I will give you children as your kings. I will give you children to rule over you. And that seems to be the case with Samson as well. Anita.
I have a question. Samson was not brought to deliver them, but to start.
Right.
Connect the dots for me for the finishing of the deliverance of the Philistines.
What was the question?
Connect the dots for the continuing of it.
The continuing of it, I think, would be finally through Saul, and David. You know, I don't think that any one judge ever put it into them, but David subjected them, you know, finally.
Let's just put an enmity between them for a long time before it finally consummated. But let's just put enmity between the Philistines and the Israelites that would carry over through David's time.
I don't know. All right. Let's see here. Let's talk about Delilah. Chapter 16. Oh, before we get to that, we have this first 3 verses of chapter 16. He goes into a harlot, he saw a woman, saw a harlot there, went into her. When the Gazites were told, Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lie in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. They were quiet all night, saying, in the morning, when it is daylight, we will kill him. And Samson lay low till midnight. And when he arose at midnight, he took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 gateposts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Okay? Any significance to this at all? I mean, they think that they're going to kill him when the sun rises, right? He just gets up at midnight, yanks the gates of the city out of the ground, carries them on his shoulders up to the hill facing Hebron.
Well, he's taking away their protection.
Yeah.
Their protection.
Yeah, he's taking away. You think you guys are going to kill me, and I am going to rob you of your security. I'm going to rob you of your protection. And of course, he eventually does take more in his death than he did in his life by the time you get to the end of the chapter. So it might be somewhat prophetic that he does that. Okay.
My Bible says that's a 38-mile trek.
How far?
38 miles.
38 miles. Good night. I don't think I could do that with a backpack. I don't think I'd do that with a handbag. 38 miles. Okay, maybe on a bicycle all day, right? So, in verse 4, now afterward it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her. Who are these lords of the Philistines? How many of them are there?
5.
There should be 5, right? The 5 major cities of the Philistines. Ashkelon, Gaza is one. Eshtaol, I think, is another one. So these lords come up, and basically, they just come to her to bribe her, entice him to find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. How much silver is that? If we're talking 5 lords from 5 cities, 5,500 pieces of silver. I read somewhere that's over 100 years worth of wages. And these guys are desperate to get Samson. What do they want Samson for, according to this verse? Humble him? Is that what yours says? New King James says afflict him. Anybody say any different?
Mine says make him helpless.
Make him what?
Helpless.
Make him helpless? Okay. The idea is to afflict him is they want to torture him. Okay? It says that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. And that's exactly what we find happening at the end of the chapter. Okay? They put his eyes out. He's spending a blind life now chained to a pole where he's pushing this big grindstone around. They're having a big feast to their god. What's the name of their god? Dagon, right? Dagon, half man, half fish. Okay? He's the one who eventually gets his hands cut off, right? Face down at the threshold because they had placed the Ark of the Covenant in his temple. The Philistines had. All right, so they call him out and say, hey, let him come out and entertain us, right? In fact, if you look at the end of verse 16 here, it says, verse 25. So it happened when their hearts were merry that they said, call for a Samson that he may perform for us. So they called for Samson from the prison, and he performed for them, and they stationed him between the pillars, right? And so performing, I don't know, let him stumble around blind, just looking at him to humiliate him, we don't know, right? But they're making sport of him. I want you to take a look at verse 19. After he very, very foolishly confesses the source of his strength to Delilah, then she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. And this is where Austin brought up the number 7. Apparently, his hair was braided into 7 strands or 7 locks. Okay? Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. It says he loved this woman. She begins to torment him as soon as his strength leaves him. She begins, not the lords of the Philistines, but her herself. And she is kind of a witchy woman, a devil woman, right? So, they bribe Delilah. In verse 6, Delilah says to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies. How many times does this go on? Three times, right? And so, what does Samson do these first 3 times? Yeah, he tells her something that's not going to make any difference. He lies to her, right? So he lies to her, okay? And in verse 7, Samson said to her, if they blind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them. Okay, I'm wondering if he's awake while this is happening. Right? Because if he's awake, he's got to be wondering, okay, this isn't a good sign, right? And now there were men lying in wait, staying with her in the room. I don't understand that one either. And I haven't read anything that explains it. Like, were they hiding behind the curtains or what? Okay. And she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when it touches fire. So the secret of his strength was not known. So the second time, in verse 10.
Great.
Yeah.
It doesn't say the same room. Mine says in an inner chamber, in where she had been lying in ambush in an inner chamber. So it may not have been the same room.
Yeah, it doesn't say the same room here. It just says with her in the room. So it might have been a chamber partitioned off with a curtain or something like that. Okay. Look, you have mocked me and told me lies. Verse 10. Now please tell me what you may be bound with. So he says to her, if they bind... Is he playing a game with her? You know, is he just messing with her? Right? It's like, you would think, okay, I told her, she bound me, and then next thing I know, there's Philistines trying to attack me. And he gets up, and of course, he dispatches the Philistines. Yet, he doesn't dispatch Delilah. And it's like, what in the world's wrong with this guy? Ken?
I think it's like from the beginning, the Lord is involved in all of this. To bring down the Philistines in his way. I think the Lord's providence.
Yeah. Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind that the Lord is using Samson to begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. But you've still got Samson acting this way, right? Austin.
So we know at the other 2 times it does say that he was specifically sleeping. So I'd be led to believe he's sleeping the first time too.
Right.
And if she doesn't wake him up by saying the Philistines are upon you until they are actually over him and trying to carry him away, kind of a thing, then he could be deceived into thinking that they're the ones who did this.
That they're what?
That
They're the ones that have got him?
Not,
Oh.
I told her and she did this to me and then I woke up like this. And then people jumped out of the closet. I think that she would have made it at least a little bit to see. Otherwise, yeah.
You just don't know, Lori.
I mean, it could be an element of pride. He's gone his whole life with this great pride in himself and his strength, and you know, he does whatever he wants.
Yeah.
And so it could have been an element of, yeah, she's doing this, but he's so prideful that he thinks he's smarter than her. He's smarter than that nothing's ever really going to happen.
Yeah,
Right.
Then she goes on to say you tricked her.
Yeah.
So it's like,
I mean, that's why I think he knows what she's doing.
well, yeah. I don't know. I think it's playing games. But
I think he's messing with her, but I think Lori brings up a really good point because you see pride throughout this. You know, the way he reacts every time. Well, I'm gonna, you know, you're not gonna get away with that. You know, really carrying the gates of the city 38 miles? You know, I'll show you. So it may very well be pride. Well, maybe his pride gets the better of him the 4th time, right? When he says, if you cut my hair. And it says in verse 15, she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies. And it came to pass when she pestered him, same word I used earlier, when she pestered him daily with her words and pressed him, so that his soul was vexed to death, that he told her all his heart and said to her, no razor has ever come upon my head. That doesn't sound like pride. Sounds like he just gave in. For I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up once more, for he has told me all his heart. And so the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hand. She lulled him to sleep on her knees, called for a man, and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then she began to torment him, and his strength left him. When we read this, there's no time markers here. So we don't know if this is happening, like one night after the other. We don't know if there could be weeks between these different events. We don't know that if she could have waited, a few days, a few weeks before she actually shaved off the hair of his head or had it shaved off, lulling him into a sense of confidence and what have you. But either way, it just seems like he's pretty dumb to me. I mean, it just does. And having not been there in this situation, who knows? Between a man and a woman, I always say, you know what? The only people that knows what goes on between a man and a woman are the man and the woman. That's it, right? And that might be the most important lesson of the evening, because every once in a while, we get tied up in other couples' affairs. The only people that know what goes on between a man and a woman are that man and that woman, right? A lot of times we think we do, but we don't. All right. What does Proverbs 6:26 say? And this is all I can think about when I read about Samuel.
For she has cast down many wounds, and all shall be slain by her with the mere strength. Her house is a way of hell, receding to the chamber of death.
Yeah, Proverbs 6:26. For by means of a harlot a man is reduced to a crust of bread, and an adulteress will prey upon his precious life. There's a lot of warnings about shady women in the scriptures and what they'll end up doing to a man, or what illicit affairs will end up doing. We don't know if Delilah was a Philistine. We don't know if she was an Israelite. We assume that she was a Philistine, but she may not have been. All right, anybody got any questions or comments about that so far?
You're not married, sorry. Craig. I'm about to say you're reading I was reading the commentary and they were talking about verse 20. It was interesting that when she yelled, Samson, the Philistines are here, after this guy's here, that he awoke from his sleep and he said, well, I'll escape as I did before and free myself. And the commentator was saying he has to know when he wakes up that weight of his hair is gone. Like he immediately would have to know his hair has been shaved.
Right.
But he still thinks he's going to have the same power as he did before, because he's broken the Nazarite vow.
Yeah.
Every other thing that he's done.
Yeah.
So why would this be different?
Right. So perhaps he's not really thinking his strength comes from God, right? Maybe he thinks it's something he possesses himself. Right. In fact, at the end of his life here, it says that his hair had grown back. Where does it say that? Yeah, verse 22. However, the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. All right, so how long does it take your hair to grow? So it's long, looks uncut. It's going to take a while. How much?
Half an inch a month.
Yeah?
Depends on the moon.
Depends on the moon?
That's what my mother said. If you cut your hair at a certain time of moon, you grow faster than it will.
Oh, man. I think that's probably one of the wildest comments I've ever heard in a Bible class. What did you learn in Bible class? That's Wednesday. Well, anybody who cuts hair will tell you it grows faster in the summertime.
Yes, it does.
All right. So his hair has grown back, and I'm not sure if he's feeling that strength returning. You know, I don't know how he was aware of it. I don't know if he's conscious of the fact, okay, my hair has grown back. But he asked that kid, take me to the pillars, and then he makes his prayer. And then there are a number of people that say the reason he's included in Hebrews chapter 11 is because of the way he ended his life, where he gives God the credit. In verse 28, Samson called to the Lord, saying, "O Lord, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines from my own eyes," or my two eyes. And so he braced himself against those pillars, pushed them apart, and there was the fall. Anybody got anything else to add to that? Okay, so now back to the original question. God spends 4 chapters telling us about Samson. Why? Why is God telling us this? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we talked about how, God obviously was giving him power to do things throughout. And at the final part where his hair's cut, it seems like he still thinks he's going to have the strength. But I mean, we see at the end when he dies that he asked the Lord to give him strength. I mean, he was aware that God was giving him power.
Okay.
Now, was he necessarily trusting in that the whole time? I think we see that he wasn't when he thinks he can cut his hair and still be able to do these things.
Right.
So, I mean, we see how God can use him. But if he, how many times we look at our life, I mean, are we aware of what God has done for us? Yes. Do we always act accordingly? Absolutely not. So, I mean, we can see how terrible it seems like Samson's life was, which it was.
Right.
But in contrast to what God provides and what we act like, I think there's just a big picture that I see looking at Samson's life.
Okay.
What's having that trust, even though we know what God's doing.
All right. Are our individual lives always on the right track?
No.
Are we always acting and behaving the way God would have us act and behave? No. We all go through periods of time where it's like we're wavering, we're not acting right, we're not thinking straight. Right? Can God still use us?
Yes.
Yeah. Cindy?
When you look at Hebrews and you see all the great people in the book of faith, and then you see Samson, you automatically think, well, there's hope for me.
Yeah, there you go. He says when you read about all these great heroes of faith in the book of Hebrews, and then all of a sudden you come along the name of Samson, you think, oh, there's hope for me. I always kind of think that when I think about Peter, right? Peter, so many times, open mouth, insert foot, right? Would reach wrong conclusions, would be hasty in his actions and his words. But God can use us. You think Samson ever entirely forgot about God? At the end, he certainly didn't. And he asked God for that strength and that help. And I think Janice makes a very valid point. God responds to that, right? Because it glorifies God. Lori.
I just keep thinking about the beginning of the story when Samson's mom wanted a baby, couldn't have a baby. The angel comes and says, God's going to give you this child.
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder if this story, God could have had a plan to use Samson no matter how he turned out as a child. Like, he had free will, his parents were raising him. God may not have had a plan from the beginning for all of this to happen this way. He might have thought they're going to raise him godly. He's going to understand that he's a Nazarite. They're going to really. So I wonder if maybe that wasn't the plan from the beginning. That maybe God thought they were going to raise him correctly, and then this could have been a completely different story. I put a lot of this on maybe his parents too, because they didn't seem to have any control over him.
Yeah.
It could have been a different story.
Yeah, at least.
And God would have used it either way.
Yeah.
And it kind of sounds like the same beginning of the story as Samuel. So we'll see. His mom wants a baby, God provides a baby, baby's dedicated to God, but they take 2 different paths in serving God to some extent.
Yeah.
Whether it was fulfilling God's will, even those through their own pride,
Right.
or following God's will because it's God's will, the right thing to do.
Yeah. You look at the whole nation of Israel, and Israel, God certainly had a purpose for Israel, right? And did Israel fulfill that purpose? Yeah, they did. Did they do it in a straight line?
No.
Did they do it in accordance with God's will all the time? No, they didn't. But God was able to use them according to his plan.
The other one that I think about when I think about Samson is Nebuchadnezzar. Someone who God used to do his will, who didn't always view God as God, didn't always treat God with the respect he deserved, but did acknowledge that he existed to some extent.
Yeah. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar's always a fascinating character study to me, along with Joab. When we get into Kings, Joab is fascinating as well. Because when David wants to number the people, Joab's the one who stands up and says, no, you don't want to do this, right? Because the kings weren't supposed to do that. All right, anybody got anything else at all?
It's a great
Kitty.
example of the power of prayer.
Power of prayer?
Because he prayed to God at the end.
Yeah. And anytime we pray, it glorifies God. Anytime we ask God for anything, it glorifies him. How does our asking God for something glorify him? How does that glorify God when I ask him for help?
It acknowledges that he's the source.
Acknowledges that he's the source. You don't ask people for things that's not within their power to give. So when we pray to God, we're asking him for these things. We're saying, I know that you can do this. I believe that you can do this. And so we ask him for help. And that glorifies him, just that very fact. Anybody got anything else before we move on? Next week, we're going to possibly, hopefully, finish up the book of Judges. And we're going to talk about some pretty depraved times in their history. All right, that's it for tonight. Appreciate your participation.
Please. We'll sing 642. We'll sing 3 verses and then the chorus one time after the verses. Do me, oh Lord, you know my strength indeed is small, lest thou should leave, I'm prone to slip and fall. Guide and direct, or evil help me stand, make me as clay in the potter's hand. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Make of my life as pleases thee each day. Weave into beauty as you have it planned. Make me as clay in the potter's hand. Father, we pray for power to be strong. Let not our lives be marked by sin and wrong. Lead to thy throne by love, take full command. Make us as clay in the potter's hand. Mold me, make me as you have me be. Take me, use me, that the lost may see. Guard me, guide me through this pilgrim land. Make me as clay in the potter's hand.
It's good to see everybody tonight. Just a few announcements. I want to welcome, of course, our visitors. We do have a couple of them. One of them being my favorite daughter. So, sorry. Did not have anybody mention to me as being sick, but out of town we have Christy in Florida. Monty is out of town, and Shirley should be back tomorrow. Craig and Shirley will need your help October 9 to help move Craig's parents to another place. That's October 9, 8 o'clock. And check your email. Craig sent out an email, and we can announce that again later. Let's remember that Gary Copeland will be preaching for us on Sunday, the 10th, on this coming Sunday and the 10th. And the duty roster it should be in your box. And a few of you remember Don and Arlene McIntyre. Well, Don passed away the other day, and his service was today. Have a card here from Jansen and Lucy. Dear O.Y. Road family, thank you so much for the text, flowers, cards, and prayers for us and Jansen's family. Also, thank you for the constant support and encouragement you have always given us. The love and support from this local Christian family means so much to us. We are very blessed. Thank you for all that you do for us. Love, Lucy and Jansen. Tommy was telling me that a couple of people have asked him about preparation for the James class. And he says, simply get one of Craig's lesson books that he's prepared, and that should help you. Well, let's see. Stuart will have announcements for the next month, so that's good. And Steve will probably try and get out of it because he's got a bad leg. Anyhow, so anything else we need to announce?
Hey, if you're gonna be able to help Craig, let him know ahead of time, because he's trying to decide if he needs to hire a moving company,
Okay.
or if he's gonna have enough help or not.
Right.
And he's not here, so I'll tell y'all, he told me, he left, he told me that everybody's been asking what they can do to help, and he said, this is where he needs help.
Okay, all right. And like I say, he sent out an email, so check your email. Okay, we'll have our closing prayer now.
Let's pray together. Our great Father in heaven, we gather before your throne of glory to praise you and to acknowledge you as our God, to thank you for being a God who is holy and righteous, who is just, who is long-suffering and patient, and you show that patience and long-suffering towards us, Father, your creation who sins against you. And despite that you love us, you desire for us to be eternally in your presence and with you. And you've made that possible through the gift of your Son, fulfilling your plan of salvation, to come to empty himself of deity, to live as a man, to go through trials and temptations, and to never sin, to be perfect and sinless, and then willingly die on the cross. Father, may we always remember as we go through our days what you've done for us and how you love us. And may we in turn love you, love those around us, and desire to be an example to them, to shine a light for you, to share the gospel with them as we have opportunity, so they too may know you and be with you forever. Bless us as we go through this week and the coming days, Father. Help us do your will always. We pray and give thanks in the name of Christ. Amen.
There's a Marcus and there's a couple others.
No warning, nothing, like this short touch. He was way too Have a safe return. Okay. Yes, thank you. It'll be fun.
It's coming in Thursday. If y'all got anything later planned, just let me know. Saturday,
Yeah.
all of the other.
I'll verify.
We're counting on it, we're getting on Thunder, because it's not on the picture. I mean, nobody else. We got 6 adults.
You gonna take a pic or something? Take it to the car?
All right, say bye to Pop Stu.
Bye.
Have a great day. Sleep well.
It's not a new house. It's funny to make them.
Thank you for talking to me.
And, say, and I'm like, I don't know that would work, because these people don't. They're always trying to hire. Yes, but I'm like, it's very funny to me how, because even us, I think if we find out about it, it's different because that's not that's what you're going to see. So I just kind of throw that out there and get your thoughts on it. This is not in relation to anyone. I was just looking at it and I was like, how funny. Because we would make it all night. No, because it affects the whole, and I put the summary just like it would affect the whole church. Now, I'm not talking about, well, like more than that. I'm not. Yeah. Or, yeah, I mean, yeah, just stuff that affects everyone. So anyway, I just thought about that, and I'm like, that's funny, our mindset is not that. If that's what you see.
Yeah, I think what happened is, I think so, you know, we have thing
now I can't get straight. Even if you know